Welcome, dear listener. Settle into the quiet hush of your evening. Let your body grow heavy and allow your thoughts to slow as we drift gently into a world of long-ago frost-covered shores, whispering pines, and distant echoes of Norse song. Tonight, we travel to the far north, to the land of the Vikings, but not in the way you might expect. There will be no clashing swords or roaring battles, no longships launching into stormy seas. Instead, we'll slip through the oaken door of a modest Viking home, warmed by embers and sealed against winter's bite. We'll linger in the subtle rituals of survival, where every breath of warmth was earned, and every nightfall brought with it a quiet test of endurance. This is not a tale of conquest, but of coexistence with the cold, with the earth, and with the turning of the seasons. So, close your eyes if you wish. Let your mind rest easy, and let us begin our journey into the winter-bound world of the Vikings. Imagine yourself stepping into the threshold of a Viking longhouse. Outside, the world lies silent beneath a soft quilt of snow. The stars glimmer above, dimmed by the thick clouds of frost-heavy sky. The wind sighs through pine and spruce. But here, inside these timbered walls, the air holds a stillness. The scent of wood smoke clings to everything dense, but not unpleasant. It wraps itself around the thick woolen tunics hung to dry, around the fur-lined bedding, around the braided hair of those who dwell within. A low fire burns in the center of the single room, its orange glow dancing faintly on soot-darkened beams overhead. Viking homes in winter were designed as sanctuaries against the biting cold, constructed primarily of timber, sod, and stone, their thick walls insulated well against the elements. Many were partially dug into the ground, like gentle hollows, allowing the earth's natural warmth to seep inward. The roofs, steep and thatched or layered with turf, shed snow easily while adding an additional layer of insulation. Inside, there was one central priority: the hearth. A sunken fire pit lay along the longhouse's centerline, burning slowly day and night. Families would gather on either side, sleeping and sitting on raised wooden platforms covered in straw, moss, and pelts. The fire's smoke, with nowhere else to go, curled slowly upward to a smoke hole in the roof. It drifted lazily, tinting the air but providing an unexpected benefit. It helped kill off lice and other pests that might otherwise find too cozy a home in the layered bedding. The fire was life. It dried soaked boots. It warmed bitter soup. It guarded against the frost that crept along every crevice of the timbered walls. At night, it glowed dimly, its coals tended carefully so as not to let it die. For though flint and tinder could start it again, every spark lost meant effort and time stolen from the already hard-pressed hours of daylight. Children, when not huddled together under reindeer hides, would be sent to the edges of the room to sleep, where it was colder. Elders and infants slept closer to the fire. Dogs and livestock might sleep inside too, depending on the home's size and the severity of the cold. Their presence added warmth, yes, but also companionship and watchfulness. You might hear the low shifting of someone adjusting a blanket, the gentle wheeze of a sleeping goat in the far corner, the snap of a log in the fire. This was the winter night quiet, but never still. Clothing played an equally vital role. Layers were everything. Undertunics made from linen or fine wool kept warmth close to the skin. Over these came heavier woolen tunics, woven tightly and dyed with subtle earth tones, deep ochres, faded greens, soft greys. Cloaks were fastened with bone or metal brooches. Boots were lined with fur, their seams sealed with pitch to keep out melting snow. But perhaps most telling of all was the mindset. Winter was not an adversary to be conquered, but a condition to be endured, embraced even. The Norse were pragmatic. They prepared with care. By the time the long nights came, their pantries were stocked with dried fish and salted meats, smoked cheese, stored grains, and fermented cabbage. Barrels of mead and ale sat quietly in corners, waiting to provide warmth of a different sort. And so the night passed, long but not lonely. In the soft dark, there may be murmurs of half-whispered stories, or an elder humming low to himself. Someone adds a piece of birchwood to the fire. The embers glow brighter, shadows lengthen, and sleep settles over the room once more, just as it has done, year after year, winter after winter, for countless centuries. As the long nights deepened and the land lay dormant beneath a frozen crust, you might imagine that the Viking people turned wholly inward idle, resting beside their hearths. But even in winter's grip, the Norse world did not fully pause. In fact, it was a season of quiet productivity. While farming slept beneath the snow, other forms of labor took its place. Work shifted indoors or into sheltered space-slow sheds or lean-tos, where breath clouded the air like pale smoke. One could hear the rhythmic rasp of whetstones sharpening blades. Tools were maintained with great kerosithes, axes, and ploughs, all honed in anticipation of spring's return. The bite of iron against stone echoed gently in the frosted stillness, a reminder that time still moved, even when the earth did not. Textiles, too, took center stage. Weaving was a constant during the winter months. In the corner of a longhouse, a woman might sit at an upright loom, threading wool dyed in subdued toner-earthy reds from madder root, muted yellows from birch leaves. Each beat of the warp-weighted loom created a soft, hollow sound, like a heartbeat muffled beneath layers of cloth. Wool spun on drop spindles, deft fingers twisting and feeding, hour after hour. This was not merely craft, it was survival. Every garment, every sock, every hood or mitten represented hours of work done by firelight. Children would help in their own way. Some carved wooden pegs or whittled small tools under the watchful gaze of an elder. Others would help fetch water from a nearby frozen stream, breaking through the brittle surface with a stick or axe. Water was gathered in clay or wooden vessels, carried back to the house carefully so that it didn't freeze solid before arriving home. And in the food stores, vigilance was constant. Salted meat had to be checked for spoilage. Barrels needed to be kept tightly sealed, away from mice. Fermented vegetables had to be skimmed and stirred. Every household depended on its winter stores, and careful management was as important as the harvest that came before. Fishing, where possible, continued in winter. Brave or desperate souls would walk out onto frozen lakes, bore holes with crude augers or chisels, and drop baited lines into the dark water below. It was slow work, and bitterly cold. But the occasional wriggle on the line could mean a fresh meal rare and treasured. In coastal communities, seaweed might be collected from icy shorelines. It would be dried and later fed to livestock or added to porridge for trace nutrition. Nothing was wasted. Even the bones from autumn's slaughter were boiled and ground into meal or carved into needles, fish hooks, or combs. And for those whose livelihoods touched the sea shipwrights, fishermen and traders' winter brought its own slow tasks. Ships, drawn up onto the beach or pulled into boathouses, would be checked and repaired. Tar was warmed and applied to hulls. Ropes were spliced and sails mended, ready for the thaw to come. Throughout it all, time passed differently. The sun, when it appeared, rose late and hovered low before sinking again. Candlelight and firelight ruled the days. But the rhythm of the work remained steady, unhurried, mindful, shaped by necessity rather than urgency. There was a quiet dignity in it. Even the most mundane task, mending a cloak, rubbing wax into a wooden spoon, was a step forward through the season. Outside, the snow fell silently, in thick, steady flakes. But within these modest homes and barns, life ticked gently on, guided by habit, bound by hope, and warmed by shared labor. Centuries have passed since the last Viking hearth-fire was extinguished, yet the fingerprints of their winter lives remain faint but enduring, hidden beneath layers of peat, ice, and time. Archaeology offers us delicate glimpses into how these people weathered not only the elements, but the slow, creeping passage of centuries. Imagine standing on a windswept plain in northern Norway. The sky is heavy with grey, and the earth is soft underfoot from a recent thaw. A small team of archaeologists kneels in a shallow trench, brushes and trowels in hand, carefully uncovering the blackened remains of an ancient fire pit. Here, amidst charred birchwood and scorched stones, lies a story. Charcoal dating and soil analysis tell us this hearth was in use more than 1,000 winters ago. Around it, bits of iron slag suggest tool repairs. Shards of clay indicate cooking. A few strands of wool, preserved by luck and the cold, whisper of nearby weaving. Farther afield, in Greenland, archaeologists have uncovered the remains of Viking farm-lonely outposts tucked into the icebound landscape, far from their Scandinavian origins. The Norse settlers there contended with harsher winters still, and their adaptations leave a haunting trace. In these ruins, we find thick double walls of stone and turf, sometimes packed with seaweed or straw for added insulation. Animal bones, stacked neatly in refuse pits, show which livestock survived the season and which did not. Even the layout of the homes tells us something. Entrances placed at angles to blunt the wind, hearths positioned with care for maximum warmth. One remarkable discovery came from Iceland, a set of human teeth, perfectly preserved in permafrost. They belonged to a woman who lived and died sometime in the 10th century. Through isotopic analysis, we learn she consumed a mostly marine diet, especially in the colder months fish, seal, and preserved kelp. Her bones showed signs of long-term exposure to chill and labor, the quiet toll of a life lived mostly indoors, but never truly idle. Artifacts, too, shed light on the colder half of the Viking year. A child's woolen mitten, knit with surprising skill, a broken sled runner carved from birch, a needle case, still filled with rusted iron needles abandoned perhaps when its owner passed, or simply misplaced on a winter journey, never completed. Then there are the sites left undisturbed in frozen time burial mounds that hold not only the dead, but their belongings. One grave, uncovered in central Sweden, contained the remains of a woman wrapped in layers of wool and fur, laid to rest with a spindle, shears, and a bone comb. These were not symbols of conquest, but of care, of daily survival, of cold nights endured. We can never truly know the thoughts of those long-gone people, but by sifting through their ash, their stone, their textile threads, we draw closer to understanding their winters not as bleak legends, but as lived experience. There is a reverence in this kind of discovery. No dramatic reveals, no treasures of gold or glittering swords, just fragments of warmth, pieces of work, and the persistent imprint of humanity in a cold and quiet world. And when the snow falls again upon these sites, whether in Norway or Iceland, Greenland or Sweden, it falls gently, as if returning something forgotten to its rest. As with so much in human history, the Viking world held layers of social, contrast-shaped by wealth, lineage, and the delicate balances of power. Though bound by the same seasons, not all Norse people experienced winter in quite the same way. Let us begin in the longhouses of the powerful. A jarl, what we might consider a chieftain or local lord, often commanded a hall far larger than those of common folk. Imagine such a space. A tall, elongated structure of heavy timber, its gables rising above the snow like the prow of a ship. Inside, the hearth would stretch the length of the room, and multiple fires might glow at once. Warriors and retainers lined the benches, their cloaks steaming from the wet, their breath misting in the firelight. A jarl's winter was still cold, still dark, but buffered by wealth furs from distant trappers, imported spices preserved in wax-sealed jars, ale brewed strong and in generous quantity. Meals were more plentiful here, roasted meats, sour apples kept in straw-lined cellars, butter and cheeses hardened with age. Servants worked quietly along the walls, pouring drink, mending garments, tending livestock in adjoining shelters. Yet even in such halls, discomfort was not entirely absent. Smoke still lingered in the rafters. Fleas and lice did not distinguish between farmer and lord. And while the wealthy might warm themselves beside thick braziers or wrap themselves in cloaks of bare fur, the darkness was shared by all. Now let us shift northward, perhaps, or inland to a modest family farm. The house is smaller, built into a slope for insulation, with just a single fire pit at its centre. The food stores are measured more carefully here. Meals are simple gruel, dried fish, a little milk if the cows have fared well. The rhythm of winter is dictated by necessity. Wake early, stoke the fire, feed the animals, mend a fence, churn the butter, wash with water broken from ice. Children help where they can. Grandparents offer stories in the dark, their voices slow and steady. And yet, even here, a kind of richness exists, not in coin, but in resilience. The family survives by planning, cooperation, and generations of knowledge passed on in quiet, everyday acts. A father knots a net, a mother checks the seal on the grain bin, an elder shows a child how to patch worn wool. In both longhouse and farmstead, winter was a time of inwardness, of storytelling, ritual, and preparation. But it is in the contrast between these worlds that we glimpse something universal. The cold touched all. The dark arrived for all. The difference was how one weathered it. While the jarl drank from carved horn and listened to skaldic verse in a hall ringed with shadow, the farmer nursed a weak calf in the straw, humming softly in the flicker of firelight. One lived amid power and oath-bound retainers, the other amid children and goats. But each lit their fires against the same night. And when spring came, if it came, Both would step outside beneath the same sun, onto the same thawing, earth-grateful, once more, to have seen winter through. As winter deepened and sunlight became a fleeting visitor on the horizon, the Viking world turned ever more inward, not only physically, but spiritually. For the Norse, the cold season was not just a time of survival, but one of deep reverence, quiet fears, and rituals old as memory. Their mythology was rich and layered, filled with beings that shaped the rhythms of nature. The great gods, Odin, Thor, Freyreach, held dominion over different elements of life and fate. Yet in the long nights, it was often the subtler spirits, the hidden ones, that occupied the thoughts of villagers and farmers alike. Imagine yourself inside a home as the sky outside turns black by mid-afternoon. The fire flickers low. There is a hush not of peace, but anticipation. Perhaps tonight is one of the blots, a sacrificial ritual to honor the gods or the land's spirits. In these winter rites, people gave thanks for the harvest just past and pleaded for survival through the cold to come. Offerings were simple perhaps, a portion of meat, a bowl of ale poured to the earth, or small carved tokens placed near sacred stones or trees. The ceremonies were not loud or dramatic, but solemn. Winter was also a time of the wild hunter spectral procession said to race across the darkened sky, led by Odin himself. To hear its howling winds and galloping hooves was an omen, and those who wandered too far from home on such nights might never return. Even inside the home, spiritual practices abounded. Small charms of iron or bone were hung near the doorway to ward off vata spirits of the land and home. Not malevolent exactly, but easily offended. A forgotten offering, a disrespected hearth, and ill luck might follow. In more Christianized areas by the late Viking Age, newer traditions began to blend with the old. The Yule season, what we now know as Christmas, was layered atop earlier midwinter celebrations. The burning of a Yule log, the gathering of kin, and the feasting all echoed pagan roots. Even the date itself, the time near the winter solstice, had been sacred long before Christian rites arrived. For children, winter was a season of whispered tales of trolls in the mountains, of frost giants roaming the borders of the world, of brave ancestors who once hunted beneath the northern lights. The stories served to pass the long hours, and perhaps keep young feet from wandering too far into the snow. Dreams, too, held greater weight in winter. With more hours spent asleep beside the fire, dreams were said to carry messages, warnings, blessings, signs. A vivid vision might be shared in the morning over breakfast, heads nodding slowly around the table as meaning was interpreted and remembered. Everything was slower, everything was more fragile, and thus belief was more present, not necessarily louder, but deeper. A quiet constant, like the coals in the hearth glowing beneath the ash, never fully extinguished. And so, amid the freezing winds and darkened hills, the Vikings kindled not just flame but faith, in gods, in spirits, in stories, and in the enduring hope that spring would come once more. When one thinks of Vikings, the image often summoned is that of the warrior broad-shouldered, axe in hand, shouting from the prow of a longship. But in winter, even the boldest warrior must lay down his sword and return home. The cold did not discriminate. It stilled even the most fearless. Winter campaigns were rare, and for good reason. Frozen roads, snow-choked mountain passes, and icy seas made travel arduous and dangerous. Viking longships, so adept in summer waters, were often drawn ashore and stored through the cold months. Their curved hulls would crack in ice if left afloat too long. So what then became of the warrior? Picture a man seated near the fire. His hair, perhaps once wild in battle, is braided now, his hands busy repairing the worn leather of his shield. The iron boss is cold to the touch. In winter, a warrior became a craftsman, a planner, a storyteller. Weapons were not merely symbols of strength, they were tools of status and livelihood, and they required care. Swords were oiled and honed with slow, deliberate strokes. Arrowheads were shaped and socketed. The haft of an axe might be replaced entirely, carved with intricate patterns while snow whispered outside. Training continued indoors where space allowed. Younger warriors Drengers might practice with wooden staves, their footfalls muffled by straw-covered floors. Muscle memory was maintained, not sharpened. There was no rush, only repetition. Calm, methodical, a winter rhythm. Elders, no longer on campaign, shared tales, not only of glory but of tactics, of survival, of mistakes made and lessons learned. These stories told in soft voices over the crackle of fire were a form of inheritance. They passed down the unspoken rules of battle, the weight of loyalty, the strategies that couldn't be taught with steel alone. But winter also brought reflection. Warriors, who in warmer seasons might ride or raid, found themselves seated beside children and livestock, tending to wounds old and new. A limp gained from a summer skirmish might ache more under the winter cold. An old scar may feel as though it breathes with each gust of wind. It was during these still months that many warriors began to carve their own runestones markers to be placed after death, or for family members who had not returned from a distant journey. The act was not morbid, but purposeful. Winter gave time for such matters. Death was not feared, but acknowledged like the snow that always fell, or the night that always came. And yet, for all their roughness, Viking warriors were not without tenderness. They might hold an infant to their chest beneath a woolen cloak. They might carve a toy from bone or driftwood, smoothing its edges by candlelight. In winter, there was no warrenly waiting. The silence allowed for humanity to emerge from beneath the helmet. And so they endured, these quiet warriors, not with roars or oaths, but through careful patience, through the polishing of a blade, through the telling of a tale, through the laying of hands on frost-chilled stone, whispering thanks for having survived another night. While much attention is often given to the warriors and explorers of the Viking Age, the steady hands that truly shaped and sustained Norse life in winter were often those of the women. As the snow gathered outside, it was their domainth home, the hearth, the unseen daily rituals that held the community together through the darkest months. Step now into a quiet longhouse on a late December evening. The fire glows steadily, and seated just beyond its reach is a woman with a drop spindle. She spins wool, her fingers practiced, the motion gentle and constant. The soft whirring of the spindle is nearly hypnotic, a calming rhythm amid the hush of winter. Weaving was not only a necessity, but a central skill of Viking women. They spun thread and wove cloth from fleece shorn months earlier. The fibers were cleaned, carded, dyed using local plants, and finally twisted into yarn. A single tunic might require dozens of hours to complete each thread, a product of labor, warmth, and quiet endurance. The upright loom, a common sight in Norse homes, stood tall against one wall, draped with works in progress. The warp was held taut by clay or stone weights. It was here that fabric was born: wool for cloaks, linen for undergarments, bands for binding and decoration. Woven cloth was valuable. In some regions, it even functioned as currency. The quality of a woman's weaving reflected not only on her household's comfort, but also its standing within the broader community. But Viking women did much more than spin and sew. They managed the stores, calculating what remained of the grain, how many smoked fish still hung in the loft, how much honey or salt would be needed to last until thaw. In coastal villages, they mended nets and salted herring. In farming communities, they saw to the preservation of milk and root vegetables, buried in earthen pits, and watched carefully for spoilage. They taught the children songs, stories, customs, and the fine details of daily life. A daughter might learn the precise way to stitch a boot, how to fold a cloak for maximum warmth, or how to read the weather in the color of the sky. These were not idle skills. They were lifelines, passed from hand to hand, voice to ear. Midwives and healers, too, held critical roles. Using herbs gathered in warmer months, angelica root, yarrow, thyme, they prepared remedies for coughs, wounds, and the fevers that came with overcrowded winter living. Their knowledge, largely unwritten, endured through practice and memory. Spiritual care also rested heavily on women. They maintained household altars, made offerings to the spirits of the land and ancestors, and performed domestic rituals meant to ensure luck and protection through the long season. In times of sickness or sorrow, it was women who lit the candles and kept vigil, they who laid the dead to rest, wrapping them in fabric sewn by hand, placing tools or tokens by their side. And always they wove, not only cloth, but the fabric of life itself, binding warmth to cold, light to darkness, birth to death. Their hands stitched winter together, one thread at a time. So while the warriors sharpened blades, and the jarls counted stores, it was often women who kept the night at bay, not with force, but with foresight. not with loud command, but with quiet constancy. And when spring arrived, it was they who opened the shutters, let the light in, and prepared the first meal to be eaten in the sun. As the Viking world slipped into the deepest stretch of winter, a curious change unfolded not in the land, which remained locked in cold and silence, but in the perception of time itself. Without the markers of sowing or harvesting, of trading or raiding, time in winter softened, became malleable. Days and nights blended. There were still tasks to complete. Of course, chores, repairs, preparation, but these did not mark the passage of time so sharply as the labour of spring or the urgency of summer. Instead, winter offered space for something else. Reflection, repetition, remembrance. In a society that prized oral tradition, storytelling became both pastime and preservation. Elders told tales not just of gods and monsters, but of places now overgrown, voyages no longer taken, kin who had passed into legend. Each story stitched together with deliberate care, passed from memory to memory like a precious garment refolded by firelight. These stories were not only entertainment, they were maps of a shared identity. They guided behaviour, explained hardship, and offered hope. Through tales, a child might understand that winters had always been hard, and that people had always endured them. In the darkness, people turned inward. Dreams stretched longer. Conversations became slower, more deliberate. Time was not wasted, it simply moved differently. It was felt, rather than measured. Some households may have kept track of the days with small carvings, notches on wood or bone. Others followed the cycle of the moon. But most people marked time by more intimate signs. The emptying of a grain sack, the length of a growing beard, the way a child's feet no longer fit in last year's boots. And then, there were the sounds. The creak of timber under snow, the drip of water from an icicle in a rare moment of sun, the call of a raven flying low across a white field. These were the clock hands of a season that defied strict keeping. Rituals helped lend structure, the lighting of candles at Yule, the communal baking of flatbread, the exchange of handmade tokens or shared cups of mead. In this way, time was not counted, but marked like gentle footsteps in the snow, visible for a while before vanishing back into stillness. By late winter, food stores grew thin, bones replaced roasts. Hunger became more familiar, but not unfamiliar. The people adapted, as they always had. Meals grew smaller, but stories grew longer. Laughter, though rare, was more treasured. Even a single egg found in a hen's nest might be greeted with a kind of quiet celebration. It was during these final months when the nights began to shorten, but warmth had not yet returned that resilience truly took form, not through bravado or strength, but through endurance, through small acts, a repaired cloak, a song hummed while stirring porridge, a child taught to braid rope. And when, at last, the first signs of thaw appeared when water trickled beneath the ice, and light lingered a little longer in the western sky, no horns were sounded, no feasts broke out. There was only a slow, shared breath, a careful, cautious joy. For winter, long and hard, was not beaten. It had been lived through, and that was enough. And so, the cold night draws to a close, not just in the Viking world we've wandered through, but here, in the quiet of your own room. You've journeyed through smoke-darkened longhouses, across frozen fields, beside quiet hearths tended with care and constancy. The Vikings, so often remembered for their ships, their raids, their gods of thunder, and war, were also keepers of warmth in a world of frost. They survived, not with spectacle, but with rhythm, with wool and stone, with salted fish and burning pine, with memory and patience. They endured winter not through conquest, but through cohesion, through family, through fire. And while the world they inhabited has passed into the distant folds of time, something of their nights remains. You can almost feel it, the flicker of a fire barely clinging to its last ember, the creak of wood as it settles into the hush, the distant howl of wind across snow-laced hills. Now, the journey ends. Let the present moment draw softly around you. Let the past fade gently into the hush of sleep. There are no more chores to do, no more stories to hear, only the calm, the quiet, and the comfort of your own warmth here and now. Sleep well, traveller, and may your night be gentler than theirs had to be.